Alrighty, well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenience, truth telling and myth busting. On this edition, are all things Middle East edition, all things Pan-Middle Easternist edition, Muslim world, all things Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, etc. We are joined by two guests: Rick Sterling, Canadian American independent journalist, media critic, NGO critic, and anti-imperialist campaigner whose work has appeared in antiwar.com, Mintpress News, Consortium News, LA Progressive. He's a contributor also to Sports Integrity Initiative and a new outlet called Al-Mayadeen. And we are also joined by the equally brilliant Ken Stone of Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, which is a superb anti-imperialist leftist organization. And yes, let's get into it. And but before we do, well, yeah. Well, first of all, Ken and Rick, thank you so much for coming on the program.
All right, nice to be here again, Youri.
Likewise, it's always great to have you. And before we get into the questions, all so anytime I ask a question, Rick, you'll be the first to answer, followed by Ken. But before I ask you your impressions on the defeats, the very tragic defeat of the Syrian Arab Republic to Western imperialism. Uh, yes, I have. Yeah, I mean, where do I even begin? Because again, Western imperialists and their fascist goons with Islamic characteristics have won again. There's so much I could say, but I'm just going to say the following: is that I feel very depressed about what happened, the defeat of Syria. I certainly feel blood boiling rage at what's happened, and the kind of depression I'm feeling, I believe, is the kind that folks who come from Latin American countries, when they see so many social achievements and fragile gains just overnight overturned, followed by a dark age of repression and violence, both physical and all the other evils that comes from regressive capitalist reforms. The defeat of Syria, I also have to say, I have to compare it to the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Communist Blocs, particularly the overthrow of the Afghan Communist Party's progressive reforms. And you know, the depression I feel, it's both crippling because you've been defeated, and unlike a sports team, there is no simple bouncing back from this. And I also just want to pay tribute to the fact that not since the indigenous resistance to settler colonialism and genocidal white supremacy that we saw in Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, and not since the Vietnamese resistance to the US and its multiple allies during the Vietnam War in the 60s and 70s, and not since the Cuban Revolution, where the communists won the battle, they won the war, but like the Haitian Revolution, they're met with economic terrorism, which which I'm even surprised that Cuba is still standing. This is what we're seeing now with the Syrian Arab Republic. And before I ask you, Rick, for your response, Ken, your response, I just have to say, I just have to say this: that the Syrian Arab Republic and its people deserve a standing ovation because not only because they were this close to defeating imperialism, they resisted the best of Western, Gulf, Turkish, Israeli imperialism. The only thing they had to overcome was the economic terrorism and Israel treating Syria the way it treats Lebanon, where it bombs the country, at least if not every day of the week, at least every other day of the week. And I was speaking to both of you guys earlier this year saying that applauding Syria's ability to overcome it, but what can I say? The Western imperialists and their fascist goons with Islamic characteristics have won. And so, Rick, yes. So Rick, yeah, my first question is just in general, what's your response? What have you been feeling? Followed by Ken.
Well, I think everybody was surprised and shocked by the speed of the collapse of the government. It's just, after all, it all began 3 weeks and a day ago. And in the in the course of Damascus collapsed 8 days ago, and it was only about 2 weeks before that that the assault was made on Aleppo. So it's shocking. And we can get into the reasons for the collapse, what we think might have was involved. But yes, it's shocking, and it's a huge setback. I think the struggle and the resistance will undoubtedly go on. It's not this isn't the end of the road. This is a very bad loss. The fact that Netanyahu is so happy and is crowing so much about it from the Golan Heights, from Mount Hermon, it says all we really need to do. It was a big victory for Zionist Israel, and for their backers in the West, and it was a loss for the people of the region, first and foremost Syrians, but also Palestinians, also Lebanese, and it's the defeat of Syria makes it a lot easier for Israel, with its puppet ally, the U.S., evidently, to proceed to escalate their attacks on Iran. So it's a big loss, but the resistance and the reason for resistance is still there, and that will go on.
Ken, your response.
Well, like you, Youri, I'm very saddened by the loss of Syria and its achievements over the years. It was the beating heart of the resistance. It was also a self-proclaimed socialist country in which they had free education up to the post-secondary level. They had universal Medicare, and they even had pharmacare, which Canada is only just starting to develop. 95% of the homes and residences in Syria in 2011 were owned privately and without mortgages. Can you imagine? The country had virtually no debt. It was, in most years, an exporter of grains. It had, in the year 2009 or maybe 2010, it had 9 million tourists come and visit it. It was a proud, beautiful, and strong country, and it has been destroyed. Hopefully, it will stay as a unit, but we know that the plan of the United States government and the state of Israel during the first decade of this regime change war, which started in 2011, was to fragment Syria, to balkanize it, to turn Syria into perhaps another Libya, a failed state in which little tiny statelets run by warlords, maybe a Christian statelet here, a Druze statelet here, a Kurd statelet here, would be fighting each other, and the US and Israel would be able to play one against the other, divide and conquer. So yes, I was very saddened by it. I disagree. I agree with Rick that the struggle is not over. I would flip one thing though, and I would say that it's the U.S. which calls the shots, and Israel is its proxy, its permanent aircraft carrier in the Mideast. The empire runs the show, and in my view, the empire coordinated this recent attack on Syria through its NATO ally, Turkey, and through its NATO associate member, Israel. Israel is an associate member of NATO. At the recent conference, Parliamentary Assembly in Montreal, which the Canadian peace movement protested with a counter summit, Israel had a fully accredited delegation in Montreal, and that caused a lot of people to come out and protest, as well as NATO's warmongering role in general. So it's the empire here that, in my view, is calling the shots, and it's the empire that has struck back to save its proxy, Israel, from destruction at the hands of Hezbollah and the Axis of Resistance. I wanted to point out two other things while we start.
Go ahead.
About the struggle going on. One is that there was an Astana process, and to my knowledge, it's not over yet. There was Astana process was a peace process. Maybe it was misguided. Maybe it was a trap. I'm not qualified at this point to say, but between Turkey and Russia and Iran and Syria, there was a peace process and a treaty that was ratified by the United Nations Security Council, saying that there would be a winding down of the war in Syria and there would be some kind of peace agreement. And they even had a meeting in Doha while the fighting was going on recently in Syria. So I'm not sure that that Mr. Jolani has complete authority to do what he wants in Syria, because there are other great powers and the United Nations involved. And secondly, I wanted to point out something that Ayatollah Khamenei of Iran said in a statement yesterday, I think it was, on Iranian TV, and he said he was fully confident that in the future the Syrian people would reassert themselves and take back sovereignty and territorial integrity for their country.
Actually, before I get to my second question and some notes I actually wanted to share, because some historical notes I wanted to share regarding Syria. Rick, is there anything you wanted to say actually in in response to those revelations that Rick gave?
No, yeah, carry on. Let's carry on.
Okay. Well, my second official question is this. Okay, yeah. So my second official question is this: what the hell did Syria do to be so hated, so epically dehumanized by people, by some of even the best of the left, countless people of the Palestine left and the broad church diaspora, much of the Western left? Because I have to say this, gentlemen, it is not normal, and it is so disturbing how countless leftists, largely white Western left, but even Palestine folks and Palestine solidarity folks and those of various Middle Easternist backgrounds, just had this hatred for Assad and all things the Baathists. Rick, your response followed by Ken.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, what you're pointing out, Youri, is absolutely true. It was always there was division within the left on that issue, and there was division within the Palestinian support community and within the Palestinian community. As to why that is, I think there are a number of factors. One is that Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez Assad, when he was president, he intervened in they were controlling Lebanon at one point, and he had some conflicts with Yasser Arafat and the PLO, and so there were some questionable conflicts, and I think that is a factor. Unfortunately, I think sectarianism is another factor, in that some of the Sunni Muslim community is has some sectarian tendencies, and those have been promoted and amplified by the West, by Saudi Arabia, and of course Qatar, which is associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, and Turkey. They were influential in Hamas. Hamas itself comes from the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt, And so they had some roots in that. And Qatar being a major funder of Hamas in Gaza, they were obviously influential. And so, anybody who's watched Al Jazeera knows that it's been very much supportive of the Syrian opposition and the overthrow of the Assad government. So those have all been, those have been significant factors. The fact that Syria was a secular government is very important. Why? Well, maybe we'll handle separately the question of why Syria was targeted so intensely by the West. But regarding the division in the left and in the Palestinian community, I think what I mentioned are some of the major factors.
Well, hold on. We'll hold that thought, and I actually do want you to expand more on that because I think it's very important what you said, and I think we should not be afraid to start to break the silence. And there are, unfortunately, outlets we do have to call out, and even folks within our movements and communities within our movements that we do have to call out. But Ken, your response. Your response.
Well, I agree with much of what Rick had to say about the sectarianism in the Gulf states and how they promoted their own agenda, which conflicted with that of the Syrian government and the axis of resistance. So that's a key point. The other point is that Western propaganda was very much against the Syrian government in the same way that Western propaganda demonizes Russia and Mr. Putin as, a megalomaniac and the Russian government as being a dictatorship. And nothing could be further from the truth. From the very start, there was a deliberate media propaganda campaign against Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian government. They demonized his country as a brutal dictatorship where he killed his own people through gas attacks, and he was a puppet of Putin and a puppet of Tehran, and he and his family were profiting and making money off the whole operation. It was basically a money-making operation, and that's not true at all. Actually, the Syria there was in the and I should point out that the Western intelligence sources spent all kinds of money promoting these lies, and in fact they promoted a remarkably false organization called the White Helmets in Syria, which they funded. The Canadian government funded to about $10 million. The British government, I think it was 40 million.
Several Nordic countries.
Rick can help me with the figures, perhaps.
Several Nordic countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, as well as Turkey, and also the Gulf states. So, yeah.
And this White Helmets operation was basically a false flag operation. It was a group that operated in Syria, only in the terrorist-controlled areas. And Vanessa Beeley and Eva Bartlett, who investigated these territories after they were liberated, found that the White Helmets offices were always located in or next to the terrorists, the Al-Qaeda offices themselves. So it was part of their operation, and they have purported to be the Syrian Civil Defense Organization. But in fact, there was already a Syrian Civil Defense Organization, and it was one of the founding organizations of the International Civil Defense Organization. What the Al-Qaeda did was they came into Syria, they captured and killed the first responders in Syria and stole their equipment and gave it to the White Helmets. And these guys, they've staged video rescues of their own terrorist fighters. They didn't lift a finger hardly to help civilians who might have been injured in the fighting. Their job was to videotape rescues that they made, that they staged, or rescues where they were rescuing terrorist fighters under the rubble in Syria. They also created false flag chemical incidents. The most famous of these was in Ghouta in 2018. And as a matter of fact, it turned out that Western journalists went and investigated this, including Tucker Carlson and I believe Eva Bartlett and others. And they found that it was impossible for the incident to happen. And they talked to the people of the area who said there was no chemical incident. And on top of this, Aaron Mate did a fabulous expose showing that the IPCW, which is the UN organization dealing with the prohibition of chemical weapons, their own field reporters reported that the chemical incident could not have happened in the way that it was made up to look as if it happened. And these reports were stifled and ignored by the IPCW. By the way, the Canadian government is one of the strongest supporters financially, the biggest supporters financially of the IPCW. In my view, they bought this report, literally, with money. They spent $10 million. They gave an extra $10 million to the IPCW that year. And so from the very beginning, the government of Bashar al-Assad was portrayed as was demonized, delegitimized, and portrayed as a horrible, brutal regime. And every time that Bashar al-Assad got reelected with enormous support in elections which were certified as free and fair by many foreign observers, many teams of foreign observers, the West denied the validity of the election. So it was a campaign of vilification from the very start, which unfortunately many people bought into.
I'm actually gonna read out these historical notes. I'm gonna switch my questions around because both you and Rick actually got the ball rolling on this question I wanted to ask, which was why were so many people just wrong, and dead wrong on Syria. And we can blame the corporate media, and we can blame all of our Western state corporate media, from the BBC to France 24 to ABC Australia, and certainly CBC Canada. But I think we need to go deeper than that, and I think we actually do have to call out Al Jazeera Arabic, Al Jazeera English, Middle East Eye, Middle East Monitor, and given so many comrades of ours were recycling their junk journalism, their junk history, and other crap from those corrupt outlets, how do we as anti-imperial, how do we, those who are actual activists, such as yourself, Ken, who campaign against these wars, and then others who are journalists like like Rick or myself, where we are confronted with an avalanche of propaganda that we have to overcome, and the fact that so many leftists who might be great on Palestine solidarity, but on Syria, like Libya and Afghanistan before, were such bootlickers for Western Gulf Turkish imperialism. How do we even go forward when we have that issue? Call it the enemy from within, call it misguided people, but how do we even overcome that? Rick, your response followed by Ken.
So the question is how to overcome the propaganda of the West?
Well, no, not so much of the West, but our own folks who watch stuff like Al Jazeera English, Al Jazeera Arabic, Middle East Eye, Middle East Monitor, and they're recycling, the junk journalism of those outlets when it comes to places like Syria, Libya before that, Afghanistan before that.
Right. Well, it's a hard task actually, because Al Jazeera's got a huge viewership, And so that it's a huge task, but I think it needs to be done, and little by little, we can whittle away at it. I think the alternative media, TikTok and X, and Rumble and some of these other platforms are providing an avenue. For example, we had alternative journalists speaking about some of these issues on Tucker Carlson before he was ousted from Fox TV. And there may be, we have. I think that this is opening some new avenues. Of course, there are some of the podcasts are have huge viewerships. So I think it's just incumbent on us to try to be factual, to try to not be, try to be factual and objective and specific, to not pretend that the Syrian government was perfect, because it wasn't. Um, and try to win over as many people as we can. I think in the end, the truth can out, but we know that we know it's a huge task, and what's the alternative is to cede the ground, to give it up, and eventually, I think the truth does out, but we know that it doesn't always, and well, I'll just leave it at that. That it's a difficult task, but we have to do what we can as effectively as we can.
Ken, Ken, I'm curious your response, but let me remix the question in a different way. I remember we were both at a press conference. I don't remember what it was, but it was something that Professor Radhika Desai of the International Manifesto Group was giving, and I had asked you this question, which is, what do we do when we have folks who may have once upon a time protested the Vietnam War, protested against the second invasion of Iraq, and people who, and like I said, people who are great on Palestine solidarity, but then when it comes to the NATO, but then when it comes to NATO, when it comes to Syria, they've jumped the shark. And some of those very people are ready for a war with China and are recycling every single garbage propaganda on China you can imagine. So I'm curious. Yes, I'm curious your response on that. How we go forward, given again so many people that we know in the Palestine solidarity movement, leading Palestine leftist voices and whatnot, engaged in in helping the imperial project in Syria.
Well, I don't have any quick fix. I think Rick said it that in a few words. How do we defeat U.S. and NATO propaganda as individuals or people within the movement? And I think what Rick does is he writes excellent articles and he gets them around. He speaks a lot. I try to organize events through the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network and the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, the Syria support movement, and so on. It's not easy to stand up against this huge siren of false propaganda that spews out 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. But I think that the only thing we can do is to keep chipping away at it, as Rick said. And I think it's helpful that you have your blog and you're interviewing us and you're interviewing other people and you're expressing your sadness about the overthrow of the Syrian government, which, as Rick pointed out, was a secular government that was the protector of all the minorities, including the Christians, which unfortunately nobody in the Christian West seems to be concerned about inside of Syria. It's unbelievable. But that's the case.
Actually, it's the same thing with Palestine. Like, I mean, like, the Palestinian liberation has always been very secular oriented. But even pushing that aside, there's a huge Palestinian Christian community which is being like fucking genocided by the Zionists, and where the hell are where is the Vatican on this? And you would think that the Christian evangelical movement would also be like, whoa, wait a minute, Jewish Zionist supremacists are genociding not just Muslim Palestinians, we don't care about them, but they're genociding our Palestinian Christian brothers and sisters. I mean, that also just baffles the mind.
Let me point out to you, please, that there were, I believe, 2 million Christians in Iraq at the time of the Second Gulf War. And those 2 million Christians, they were forced by events to flee Iraq. Some of them are living around the corner from me here in Hamilton, Ontario, but most of them ended up in Syria. Syria took them in. And you never heard a word about this in the West.
In fact, this might be controversial to say, but I think it's even better to be a Christian, certainly one of a Greek or Armenian background, or even one of a Spanish background, in a country like Syria or Iraq before the criminal invasion and overthrow of Saddam Hussein, than in Turkey, which on paper is supposed to be a secular republic. But yes, it does baffle the mind. I actually wanted to read this. My friend Saheli Chowdhury of Orinoco Tribune, we recorded an episode last week about Argentina, and off the air we were talking about Syria and so forth. And Saheli said a lot of very interesting things about Syria as to why was there such a particular focus of Western imperialists, and why so much effort was devoted to even getting so many leftists, the largely white leftists, but even our Palestinian brothers and sisters and the Middle East diaspora, to hate the Syrian government so much. And well, Saheli said the following, which I personally think is worth reading. And she said this: like Libya, in 2011, there was no mass uprisings in Syria. There was a smattering of protests here and there, but that happens anywhere in the world. There were protests in China during the lockout. It was nothing like overthrowing the government. However, media presented it as such because the U.S. has built a vast operation to overthrow the Syrian Arab Republic from the 1950s. It was a Cold War issue as well as a Zionist issue. Then in 1967, the Pan-Arab Socialist Movement lost against Zionism. The Syrian Arab Republic and Egypt were separated, but they used to be the Arab Democratic Republic. Bashar survived even though they lost the Golan Heights. Anyways, what I'm telling you is this. The Syrian Arab Republic was a Soviet ally in the Arab world, and the plot to overthrow Syria was in the works at least since the 1950s. It took on different forms over the years, but the essence was always the same, and Syria was also part of the Zionist entity's Greater Israel project, which we're seeing unfolding before our eyes. Saheli continues, in the 21st century, the war against Syria basically turned into a hybrid war, the first hybrid war of this century, when the Arab Spring, which I have to say was largely just a color revolution, broke out in the region. The proxies of the empire took advantage of it to destabilize 3 Arab states where there was no extensive anti-establishment sentiment: Libya, Algeria, and Syria. Note the 2 African countries. The same intense propaganda campaign was applied for Libya and Syria, that both governments were committing genocide. The only government that commits genocide in the region is Israel. Al-Qaeda was unleashed against both of them. However, the Al-Qaeda thing is never discussed in these terms as a U.S. proxy. Among the Western left in general, they fell for the genocide narrative. In Libya, it was save the women. In Syria, it was save the Kurds. Yet the mass rape of women in Libya was a lie, propaganda, like WMDs in Iraq. In Syria, those who claimed that Kurds were in danger were precisely Al-Qaeda sources. There was a Kurdistan autonomy demand in parts of Syria for a long time. Mind you, there is not a Kurdish majority in Syria. Not even Haksesh, or Rojava as Westerners call it, where 25% of the population is Kurdish, the rest belong to various nationalities. The Arab tribes in the region have always been dead set against Kurdistan. It isn't a black or white issue, and it isn't something that could be solved easily in a multi-ethnic country like Syria. The U.S. went in, what was termed Rojava, supported the Kurdish separatists, but we have to remind our folks that Kurds are not a monolith, occupied Syrian oil and wheat. It was the perfect way to cut the Syrian government off of Syrian resources. Then the U.S. State Department created the Rojava Kurdistan narrative, which so many people fell for. It also caused divisions within Syrian society, cast a veil over suspicion against all Kurds in general, and even within the government, because it was not possible to determine who was a U.S. plant or not. In closing, Turkey, in the name of safeguarding its national security from Kurdish separatism, went into Syria fighting against its own allies, the U.S.-backed Kurds. In reality, Erdogan and neo-Ottoman fetishists like him have always had their eye on northwest Syria. What is today the territory of Turkey used to be part of Syria during the Ottoman Empire. The Sykes-Picot division gave that away. Many people don't know this. And when asking her, well, actually, before I go further, I'm curious both of your responses to all of that.
Well, I think regarding the Kurds, they've been definitely manipulated in the region that they effectively control. It's in some of the areas, it's just like your friend there was commenting, they're not even a majority, and yet they are able to rule. The idea of an ethnically distinct country is not a progressive notion in itself. I mean, that's the whole idea behind the quote unquote the Jewish state. The idea of ethnicities being privileged, having having special rights based on ethnicity. In no way is that progressive. It's reactionary. But of course, Israel would like to promote that so that they're not the only one that has that that is based on those kind of ideas. So I think, and another thing is that the Kurdish community within Turkey, the majority of it does not want a separate state. And in 2015, Erdogan nearly lost the election, and it would have been history could have been very different for Syria if Erdogan had not prevailed in that election. Because the progressive Kurds were allied with progressive other ethnicities in Turkey, the People's Party, and so forth, and they almost prevented Erdogan from winning, and the AKP from winning the election. And then, of course, he transformed the constitution and assumed a presidency. So history could have been very different, and the Turkish Kurds are not. They've changed their program, their goals, and they're working within Syria, and they're allying with other progressive Turks to try to change the policy. So that's a kind of a reactionary slogan. Of course, the Kurds through the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces, and even which is very much manipulated by the U.S., which directly played a role in changing their name from the YPG to the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces. That the U.S. even managed their naming change. Because for a Western audience, anything that's called democratic is looked on favorably. So there's been a lot of manipulation going on, a lot of disinformation going on, and it's also worth pointing out that the Kurds have been have done backhand deals with Israel, and the Kurds in Iraq played a very reactionary role there as well.
There's more I could say, but Ken, your response.
Well, I think, we're still on the issue, I think, of the demonization
Yeah.
of Syria and the
Mhm.
propaganda war. And we have
Mhm.
to keep in mind that this propaganda war is part of the hybrid war. It was to um, destabilize and destroy the Syrian Arab Republic. And that the reason for that is that the US was trying to regain and is trying to regain its unchallenged hegemony over West Asia, which is a very resource rich area, very strategic continent, the land bridge between Europe, Asia, and Africa. They wanted to regain this, and they had been losing it ever since 1979, when the Shah of Iran was kicked out of office by a popular revolution led by the late Ayatollah Khomeini. And the Islamic Republic since then has been an active opponent of the U.S. government and of Zionism, and since then, it has helped to build up a axis of resistance in West Asia. And so, and the fact also that Syria had an alliance, a formal alliance for some 50 years with Russia. And in fact, there were and still are today, we don't know if it's going to remain there, or if they're going to remain there, the two Russian bases, a naval base at Tartus and an air base nearby. So the U.S., in trying to regain its hegemony over West Asia, it pulled out all the stops against the Syrian government. It created, the U.S., the CIA, under Obama, created Operation Timber Sycamore to overthrow the government. The British MI6 had the white helmets and all kinds of other propaganda operations. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars. The Canadian government alone, from what I know from early figures, originally the Canadian government had allocated under the Friends of Syria group of countries, which was the coalition of the willing that Hillary Clinton created in 2012 to prosecute the regime change war in Syria. Canada donated $600 million to take care of the refugees that were going to inevitably be created by inserting terrorist armies into Syria. But as it turned out, Hamilton MP, member of parliament, his name is David Sweet, he revealed before Conservative.
Oh, okay, interesting.
He was a Conservative member under Stephen Harper. Maybe he did this when he thought nobody was listening, but it's recorded. And he said that out of the 600 million, and this was early in the war, 185 million of that went toward the regime change operation, arming the fighters, creating rebel radio stations, training young people in the arts of social media, doing all the kinds of things that the West does all the time and is doing right now in Georgia, trying to have color revolutions to overthrow governments that are not compliant with U.S. foreign policy. And in fact, I would argue that right now, I would argue that the U.S. is looking for ways to put pressure on the Russian Federation precisely because the U.S. NATO regime proxy war in Ukraine is going very badly, and they're losing it. And so they are trying to punish Russia. And one of the ways they punished Russia was to defeat the Syrian Arab Republic.
Also important when we talk about why is there such a bizarre, unique hatred for for the Syrian government, which I think is so out of whack compared to even past governments, which you can have legitimate grievances of, like Saddam Hussein. Like, the Syrian government was not as sectarian as the Iraqi government, for example, which did engage in various forms of racism, but at least on paper was a secular Arab, Arab republic. The Syrian government, though, has always been on the side of the Palestinian people, which is what I also find very, very bizarre. On so many people celebrating this non-existent moderate, celebrating the non-existent moderate rebels and this non-existent revolution. So I asked Saheli, what is, why that is, and Saheli, responds saying the following: Hafiz al-Salad's government, when it comes to Lebanon, did support the Maronite right-wingers of the Tel al-Zatar massacre that did rightly upset people in Lebanon. However, in the 1980s, the Syrian government was back to supporting the PLO in Lebanon. That was when the Muslim Brotherhood terrorism started in Syria. Since then, Syria always supported the forces of resistance in the region until now, when we see the Zionists strolling through Damascus. I don't know what evil thing Hafez al-Assad did that is inexcusable for the Western left. Perhaps having a real secular democratic state besides a fake one, Israel, the land reform, relations with the USSR, modernizing Syria. But she did say that that Syria did occupy parts of Lebanon and support the Maronites, and it was a mistake, which Hafez al-Assad did recognize. The support supposedly was because of the opposite side of the Muslim Brotherhood that was threatening Syria. And at the time, there was Lebanese Islamic Jihad that had declared a goal of converting Lebanon and Syria into a single Islamic republic. It would have been very unsustainable, so Hafiz al-Assad felt himself pressured to act. But by the early 1980s, what is today Hezbollah took over control of that organization, discarded their Islamic Republic dream, and simply wanted a Syria in which all Syrians, Lebanon, of all Lebanese backgrounds to unite and simply respected the sovereignty of the Syrian Republic. And the Syrian state by then went back to supporting the PLO and the Lebanese bloc resistance again. Syria did do land reforms, and that remains a part of the constitution of what was the Syrian Arab Republic. And of course, that's where you have, Rania Khalek told me that the kinds of bourgeoisie, affluent plutocrats that make up a large part of the Syrian diaspora have always hated the Syrian regime for those land reforms. And so you will often find, folks who claim to be secular Syrians and so forth, who are against the Assad government and are supporting, non-existent moderate rebels and this non-existent revolution. But basically, those are Syrian elites who basically want their shit back, and they don't give a shit about whoever controls Syria as long as they get their stuff back, which I think is quite interesting, given that the Syrian rebels that have, that have taken over claim they want capitalism and they want a free market. So I'm curious both your responses. I'm curious both your responses to that. First Ken, then Rick.
Well, I think one thing that we haven't yet talked about in this in this interview is the economic levers with which the U.S. and the West used to destroy Syria. And that's something that Rick is really an expert on. He did a number of articles and speeches about the Caesar sanctions, which were imposed on both Syria and I believe Lebanon in 2019, 2020. But let me give you a little update on how those sanctions got going. So the sanctions started as a result of meetings of the Friends of Syria group of countries, which I told you about. That group had its first opening Congress in Tunis in 2012. I believe it was February. And guess who laid the basis for that meeting? It was Glenn Davidson, Canada's ambassador to Tunisia, who prepared the meeting for Hillary Clinton to rope in about 70 countries into the regime change operation. besides dividing up the tasks of who was going to supply the arms and who was going to provide the bases and the training for the terrorists, they also thought about how they were going to punish Syria economically. And so they developed over a period of time a list of sanctions. And these sanctions, after a series of meetings, were formalized. Guess where? Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, in June of 2013. A complete set of brutal coercive economic measures, commonly called economic sanctions, which did not have the approval of the United Nations Security Council. Therefore, they were illegal. But they applied them to Syria, and the results were almost immediate. The Syrian currency plummeted in value. People could not afford to put food on their table. Unemployment rose immensely. Trade dropped dramatically. The Syrian economy tanked. They were unable to get parts for the electronic electricity generation, and so we had a situation in Damascus, as it is now. They're lucky if they get 4 hours of electricity per day. So this is how bad it got. Rick can tell you more about the Caesar sanctions because they included secondary sanctions, that punished banks or companies that transferred money. And so what the U.S. did was it established extraterritoriality, making it impossible anywhere in the world, not just in the United States or its colonies or protectors, but anywhere in the world for people to transfer money or medical supplies to Syria or humanitarian aid, even during the horrible earthquake that took place a few years ago. So this is the reason, I would say this is the main reason that Syria collapsed so dramatically all at once, is because in the last 4 years since the Caesar sanctions, the earthquake, and all that Syria was basically hollowed out. The government's federal spending in Syria declined 70%, 70. The government of Bashar al-Assad had to demobilize parts of the army because they couldn't pay them. Syrian soldiers were being paid, generals were being paid the equivalent, I'm told, of $40 US a month, whereas the Takfiri, the terrorist mercenaries who came in the other week from Turkey were paying between $1,000 and $2,000, depending on their ranks, a month as a salary. So that gives you an idea. And you can use it as an example, a second example to what happened between the first and second Gulf Wars in Iraq, where after the first senior Bush attacked Iraq, then for 10 years, economic sanctions were
they even call it sanctions of mass destruction. In fact, the
yes, and 500,000 Iraqi children died, but Madeleine Albright said it was all worth it. And so when the Bush-Blair attack came in 2003, Iraq was just a shell of its former self, and it fell within a few days. And the same thing happened here in Syria. So we should talk about the coercive economic measures, the campaign of brutal sanctions a bit, and maybe Rick can give you more on it than I, because he's an expert on it.
Well, Rick, before you respond to what to what Ken and our audience, myself, want you to expand on, I remember interviewing Radia Khalek, and she first was describing the horrific what Syria had to go through militarily, which was you have the Gulf monarchs, Turkey, Israel, the U.S., Canada, and its NATO allies, launching a proxy war and exporting all of these Wahhabi, Salafist, Takfiri, whatever you want to call them, but these death squads into the country. and then but Syria managed to overcome all those enemies, and then came the economic terrorism. And I remember asking her, so is Syria experiencing the sanctions of mass destructions the way Iraq experienced them after the first Gulf War? And then Rania basically said yes, except this is in reverse. First, because of the fact that first, first it's the Western military aggression. They didn't win there, but then comes the economic terrorism. But we see before our own eyes that the U.S. used that, followed by, okay, now that Syria is at its weakest, a military coup. So I'm curious. So what more actually?
You're frozen,
about the
Youri.
Caesar sanctions? Gentlemen, can you still hear me? Guys, can you hear me?
So maybe
Hey guys, can you hear
no,
me?
you were frozen for the last minute, Youri.
Okay. Well, anyways, Rick, just talk a bit more about the Caesar sanctions and what and how that played a part in Syria collapsing.
The Syrian collapse, I think Ken's right that the sanctions imposed by the U.S. and the West had a huge impact, and it's absolutely correct that the economy was hollowed out. Under the Caesar sanctions, countries and companies were prohibited from dealing with the Syrian central bank. So Syria couldn't buy things from external companies and countries without falling in violation, and then having the sanctions or penalties imposed on them. And they're not trivial penalties. Sometimes there's billions of dollars that have been imposed on global corporations. So any mention of trade or contracts with Syria were rejected out of hand, and the impact was huge, coupled with the impact of the sanctions, which were also greatly limiting the Lebanese economy. You had the proxy forces on the east, and 25 to 30% of Syria being effectively controlled by an opposition force, the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces. And in that 30% of the country, which was largely desert, but not only desert, it was the primary wheat growing area. So you had the wheat growing area, the oil producing area of Syria occupied by the U.S. and its proxy forces. So that brought the economy to its knees. That resulted in an oil-producing country not having oil to provide electricity for more than 3 or 4 hours a day for its population. So you had the impoverishment of the people and the demoralization as well, because what could they do to fight back? You had Israel bombing Syria over the last year. It was every week they were bombing Syria with impunity. So you had demoralization, the impoverishment, and I think one important question is why did the West do this? Why did they prioritize that? And I think I agree with the analysis that it was partly Russia. Partly this was a way to get back at Russia, because Russia has very few external bases, and they had a naval base on the Mediterranean in Syria. And that was viewed. So this is the collapse of Syria is definitely a significant loss for Russia.
But what I find also, actually, continue.
Yeah. So I think another big factor is that Syria has been on the hit list, and specifically Benjamin Netanyahu's hit list since 1995. when he wrote his book, Fighting Terrorism. And the context was that the Likud party and Benjamin Netanyahu and Ariel Sharon were vehemently opposed to the Oslo Accords and the agreements that Israel had signed in the Oslo Accords. And they were hell-bent on destroying. And Netanyahu, in his book, Fighting Terrorism, he talks about how they have to go after those governments which support the Palestinian resistance and the Lebanese resistance. And he specifically named Libya, Syria, and Iran. And so we know what happened in Libya, and we've seen what happened in Syria. Netanyahu talked about this as being a war between civilization and those who would, not just terrorists, but basically, people who want to destroy Western civilization. And supposedly Israel is the creation of Western civilization, when we know it's the creation of Western imperialism. So I think that was a big factor. And Netanyahu also talks about political and economic sanctions. So a lot of this is really following the script. And we've seen how the West, the neocons who have had control of U.S. foreign policy for the last 30 years, this has been implemented, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, it doesn't matter. It was begun under the Bill Clinton presidency. It continued through the Barack Obama presidency, as well as the Trump and into the Biden presidency. So it's been U.S. foreign policy, which is very much in alliance with Israeli foreign policy and the wishes of the most racist and reactionary. Just one last comment is it's interesting where Benjamin Netanyahu describes in his book, he defines terrorism.
Yeah.
So the title of the book is Fighting Terrorism. He has to define terrorism, and terrorism is defined as killing civilians. And of course, he was speaking then over the few years when Hamas would send suicide bombers and they would blow up a bus, and hundreds of Israelis were killed. But if by any objective measure, we have a terrorist state, that is Israel, which has killed tens, if not hundreds of thousands of civilians in Gaza, and played a major role in the invasion of Iraq, of inducing and promoting the invasion of Iraq, which resulted in 1 million or more dead Iraqi civilians. So we can see the double standards there. We can see the lies, the deceit, and the fact that neocon policy is very much in alliance with Zionist foreign policy. It has become the foreign policy of the U.S., and that is what absolutely needs to be confronted and challenged and changed.
I have three more questions for the two of you, but I have to. But I wanted to raise this point again because I don't think.
Yeah, you're just a quick interruption. I've got another commitment, and I'm going to have to be going in about 10 minutes.
Okay, well then in that case, Rick, answer these. Okay, in that case, answer these two questions. Don't you think Russia's inability to save the Syrian government and China's China's I think deep addiction to diplomacy, which is we respect everybody's sovereignty, including Israel's sovereignty, and we want to make peace with and their efforts to make peace between Saudi Arabia and Iran, because come on, guys, we should be uniting everybody and doing trade and so forth. Don't you think that the fall of the Syrian government and Israel continuing to run roughshods around us, the fact that Turkey betrayed both Russia and both Russia and Iran, in terms of sticking to the peace pledge that they made, shows the severe limitations of BRICS, and that you cannot have multipolarity when you still have Western imperialism as an institution. That needs to be completely eradicated. So I'm just curious your thoughts on I'm just curious your thoughts on that before you have to leave.
Mm-hmm. Do you want Ken to go first, or me?
No, you go first because you have to leave soon.
Okay. I think ultimately Russia and China, they're not responsible for what goes on in Syria. They can play a supporting role. Iran, Hezbollah, they can play a supporting role, but it's the job of Syrians. I think there is some criticism that's warranted regarding the Assad leadership. It was far too remote. The contrast between other states which are under intense pressure from the US, for example, Venezuela, where President Maduro has a totally different style of leadership, where he's actively in front, he's speaking to the people, he's responding to events of the day. Bashar Assad, and I've met him, and I participated in a Worker Day, a May Day celebration in Damascus, where he gave a brilliant ad hoc talk about the importance of workers and Syria's position on that. So there's no doubt as to his intelligence and his principles in my mind, but he was far too remote in his presidency, and I think ultimately that played the leadership, the failure to challenge and to deal with corruption. It came back to bite. It came back to bite them. And when I was in Syria, frequently I heard people talk about, number one, they need to deal with terrorism. Number two, corruption. And corruption is corrosive. And when you see one corrupt person being able to do it and get away with it, then other people say, well, what am I standing on principle so much? Syrian army soldiers that are paid $7 a month, Syrian army generals that are paid $40 a month, they're going to be vulnerable to corruption. They're going to be vulnerable to bribery. So I think there were internal problems.
But that said, it's Western sanctions breeds corruption. I mean, if you're fighting
exactly,
with hands,
yes,
if you're fighting
exactly,
with hands tied behind your back all the time, there's only so much you can do before things just collapse, and that's why I still don't want to blame. I do think that the Assad government has a terrible PR system and need a better communication skills. But stuff like corruption, that only comes because of endless Western sanctions.
Well, it comes, but it can be handled lightly, or it can be handled very starkly. But you're right that you have to have the means of countering it, and you have the means of, you crack down on corruption, you're going to have more people who are opposing and turning on you. So I realize it's a very delicate thing, but. No doubt that the reasons for the problems were the external attacks, so I think that's the primary focus that needs to be made. And there's just one other comment that I'll make, which is that there were definitely betrayals from Turkey and the Astana Accord. They didn't abide by that, and I think I was commenting yesterday on how frozen conflicts, in a way, it was it was kind of a frozen conflict where the terrorists were allowed to continue to control Idlib province, which was nurtured by the West, where they had better living conditions than the rest of Syria, where the militants were re-equipped, given modern equipment, given drones, given training in drones, given tanks and high-tech vehicles and were trained politically as well, so that you had them exercise PR skills.
Yeah.
You know, Jolani saying, and he's being labeled as diversity friendly. So this is the person who's coming from ISIS and Al Qaeda. So he was obviously given a lot of PR skills, but I think coupled with one similarity with Ukraine is where you had a frozen conflict there. You had the Minsk Accords, and supposedly the Donetsk and supposedly the Donbass was going to be considered as an autonomous region, and that they would find some resolution, where in fact the West used the frozen conflict, NATO used the frozen conflict to build up the neo-Nazi and the Ukrainian forces to launch attacks on it. What happened in Syria was that NATO and the West used, and Turkey used the frozen conflict and used it to build up the terrorist forces in Idlib, while they were squeezing and they were impoverishing and they were making a very difficult the situation for the rest of Syria. So I think the Russian Federation is definitely going to be looking at frozen conflicts with a different light in future. And I think this is an element where you freeze a conflict, it can be no solution in the long run.
Well, Rick, I know you have to go, so just before you go, and me and Ken will continue our conversation. Just got, I promise,
Mhm.
got 3 questions left. But before before we get to that, we have to. We were joined by Rick Sterling, Canadian American independent journalist, media critic, NGO critic, and anti-imperialist campaigner, whose work has appeared in Mintpress News, Antiwar.com, Consortium News, LA Progressive, and Sports Integrity Initiative, and Al-Mayadeen. And Rick, keep doing the great work you're doing. I hope we have you back on in the very near future. But until then, a very
Yeah.
Merry Christmas to you and your family, and thank you so much for all the work you've done on Syria. You
Yeah.
don't get enough credit for it, but I have to thank you, because it's actually your journalism and folks like Rania Khalek, Eva Bartlett, and so forth that really opened my eyes and really inspired me to actually want to become a journalist. And for all the work you've done on Syria alone, thank you, and Merry Christmas.
Yeah.
Enjoy the
Well,
rest of your trip.
yeah, thanks very much, Youri, and keep up your good work. And Ken, I'll be seeing you later in the week. So take care. Take care, both.
Thank you. So Ken, as we wrap up, my last 3 questions are this. But the first, but I'm curious your response when it comes to the in how the defeat of Syria shows the extreme limitations to BRICS. Because look, I think we should live in the multipolarity world. I often am puzzled by people who say that we need a new non-aligned movement, and we need to have a neutrality movement, when that's exactly what multipolarity is. And BRICS basically is saying that BRICS does respect everybody's sovereignty, regardless whether you have a theocratic system like Saudi Arabia, whether you have a dictatorship like in some African country, or whether you're an Islamic republic like Iran, or a socialist government like Venezuela. But that being said, you can't have multipolarity is a pipe dream. As long as Western imperialism is alive and well, and that is a system that needs to be eradicated from the face of the planet Earth and never regrouped, then I think BRICS will never ever will be allowed to flourish. So I'm curious your response on that, because I think the Chinese, their intentions are good, that we need to have that we need to have detente between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and trying to bring all countries together to even respect basic Palestinian sovereignty. But the fact that Syria was allowed to collapse the way it did, doesn't that show that Russia and Iran were stupid to have trust Turkey, And that again, as long as you have Western imperialism, forget BRICS and even the whole concept of multipolarity. So I'm curious your response, to that.
Well, I couldn't agree more that Turkey played a dastardly role in Syria in contravention of the Astana process, which, as I pointed out before, was a treaty recognized between Russia, Iran, Syria, and Turkey by the United Nations Security Council. And I'm not sure that Astana is over yet. We have to see how things unfold. But Turkey clearly violated that agreement. And I think Rick is also correct in saying that the Russians and the Iranians regarded it as a frozen conflict, and this is the danger of frozen conflicts. And he referred to the not to the Minsk Accords as the previous example. So it's not my place, I think, to apportion blame to certain countries. I think that there's a lot of blame to go around. And I think in the next months and years, when people smarter than me, write the histories of this, they will properly apportion blame to those parties that caused the demise of the Syrian socialist government, a secular government that stood for the protection of religious and ethnic minorities. But on your bigger question is BRICS. And I do believe that BRICS is a great development. I think that it has prevented the economic war against Russia, which was part of the hybrid war that NATO was waging as part of their proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. They were expecting to bring Russia down economically, and they failed to do so. And that's because there is this move towards multipolarity, and Russia was able to trade outside of the European Union, outside of the tentacles of the U.S. empire. They were able to evade the sanctions. And I think Iran is also overcoming the sanctions, which dragged it down significantly under the last Trump administration, when Trump abrogated the JCPOA and instituted a campaign of maximum pressure, which was completely illegal. Both of those events were completely illegal, but the U.S. empire gets away with it. I think if BRICS can create an alternative trading system, an alternative money transfer system, it will help protect countries that are under attack by the U.S. empire. And so I'm all in favor of it. I don't know how this is all going to play out. The U.S. empire is acting in the most reckless fashion at this moment. People have described it as using a metaphor as a drunken old white man with a shotgun wandering around, firing it off in all directions. I think that's an accurate description. We are close to World War III, thanks to the U.S. And NATO in Ukraine, in West Asia. And now, on top of all this, U.S. leaders and generals are talking about taking on China over Taiwan, not in the distant future, but in the next year or two, 25, 26, 27, they're talking. So we are in a desperate situation.
I think we're already in World War III. I think what happened in Syria, the part of my language, but the clusterfuck situation that is Ukraine, and all these color revolutions and whatnot are all part of some.
You were frozen there for about a half a minute.
Sorry
you were talking about World War III.
Yeah, I
and
was.
Many commentators.
Exactly.
I mean, John Pilger said years ago that World War III had already started. And there are many commentators now saying we are in the first steps of a kinetic World War III. World War III, where people are actually shooting at each other, countries are falling, and people are fleeing.
Exactly,
so
exactly. And I think, and it's all connected. It's all connected. And I think that's where we have to really, I think going forward in the future, that's where we have to really emphasize to people that you may think that what's happening in Ukraine is completely separate from the defeat of Syria, and you may think that Syria and West Asia has nothing to do with Latin America. Ergo, we have to all have our different solidarity movements, but no, it's all part of one ghastly system that is Western imperialism that needs to be eradicated. And I think my second, so my second to last question actually is this.
Can I say one thing?
Yeah. Go ahead.
I had it cut out of the Hamilton Spectator, but it's in a different room right now. So the Mark Rutte, the head of NATO, said on
former Dutch Prime Minister.
That's
Very
right. He said on Thursday, I don't have the exact quote, but he said that World War III is unfolding and NATO now has to get on a armed footing. This was 4 days ago. This is the head of the US military alliance to which Canada belongs.
Unbelievable.
And this is a very important reason for people who believe in peace and cooperation to get out on the streets and get start getting active in local groups or in parties that oppose war and start agitating for an end to the US inspired imperial wars that are being waged right now and are likely to come even more in the next few years.
But when it comes to that, that's actually my second to last thing, and then we'll get to our closing thoughts. Is this because that's going to be because that is going to take a huge mammoth effort. Like we literally have to move heaven and earth to get to that because I don't have the statements in front of me right now. I will share them on the links. But for example, you have Code Pink, which is one of the best anti-war, feminist groups, peace groups, anti-imperialist groups, and yet, if you see some of their statements, if you on what happened in Syria, they're cheering on the Syrian Revolution, while at the same time saying that we have to be careful about the future of Syria because of Western imperialism, making contradictory statements like that. David Swanson, I consider him a friend. I love David. World Beyond War even allowed me to platform Alfred Josias, Johnny Atchie, and Rick Sterling. The online event was Stop the Western Gulf War on Syria, and he was talking bizarrely about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Syria, to which I say no, because that lets the imperialists off the hook, and that's and Syria has nothing to apologize for. This was a country that was defending itself from Western Gulf Turkish Israeli aggression. So I'm sorry, anybody who got killed in the crossfire and any terrorist that was captured by Syria, I don't believe in torture, but they got what was coming to them. And then you have the Palestine youth movement. These are the most left-wing, secular-minded, non-sectarian Palestinian diaspora folks celebrating the defeat, the fall of the Syrian, the fall of the Syrian regime, and celebrating a non-existent revolution. So, Rick, how do we go forward when even the best of the left is recycling Western imperial garbage, or if not Western imperial garbage, there's certainly recycling Qatari garbage of Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye, Middle East Monitor, and whatnot.
I haven't read the statements from PYM yet, so I can't. I'll take your word for it. What I would say is that history is a good teacher, and if the events in Syria lead to a failed state, lead to the massacre of religious or ethnic minorities, I think these people, anybody, and not necessarily these people, but anybody who cheered on the so-called HTS revolution are going to have eggs on their faces, and they're going to have to, reconsider what they had said. And if they don't reconsider what they had said, we will remind them of what they had said. And I think that's probably the best way for people to learn, is by their mistakes. The people have forgotten, in this euphoria about the collapse of this Syrian government, that 500,000 people died. 500,000 people died. 5 to 6 million Syrians had to leave the country because of the attacks and the economic war on Syria. And they flooded the neighboring countries, Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, and they went up into Europe, and that caused a lot of kerfuffle as well, which has still having an effect today, and in Canada too. And Syria's infrastructure was destroyed. People were hungry. 80% of Syrians were food insecure last year. So we have to understand, I hope people can understand that beyond these accusations of torture and gas attacks, and which have all proved to be false in the past, is the truth that this was a war by the people you mentioned to destroy a sovereign country in violation of the UN Charter and international law.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. I think okay, well, that's a perfect segue to this, which is last which is last thoughts. I'm going to let you and well, yeah, last thoughts, which is anything you want, last thoughts, which is anything you want to say going forward, anything you want to emphasize to people who are still foolishly thinking that this was some revolution. And I'll just say that I think it's interesting that, Libya, it took less than, let's see, 2 weeks for monstrous Islamists to run the country, who they're not even unified, like a bunch of piranhas. They're eating one another. So I thought it's quite interesting that Western imperialists and their partners felt the need to emphasize that we're supporting moderate rebels, we're supporting Kurdish and narco syndicalists and so forth. So that's interesting. But yeah, Rick, any last thoughts? And if you want, feel free to even pay a tribute to the Syrian Arab Republic. And go right
ahead. Well, I think that what happened in Syria was a tragedy, a vibrant state with a high standard of living, and a pluralistic state was destroyed. And I felt the same way as you did about the destruction of Libya, which, by the way, was done by NATO in violation of an agreement they made at the United Nations about a no-fly zone. And guess guess where the general in charge of NATO's operation in Libya came from? It came from Canada, General Bouchard. Okay, and I also felt the same way about the destruction of the former Yugoslavia, in which NATO again illegally bombed the country for 78 days and then staged a color revolution to remove Slobodan Milosevic, sent him to The Hague, where he died because they wouldn't give him the proper medical attention. These are all crimes. And it's, as you say, it happens again and again because the US empire is intent on establishing its hegemony over the entire planet, whether we like it or not. And so people had better wake up, because when the fighting between two antagonists spreads from Europe and Eastern Europe to the West Asia and to China, that is called a world war. And it looks like it's brewing. So people had better get together, and join some peace organization or some party that stands for national sovereignty, territorial integrity, peace instead of war, getting out of NATO, cooperating with all the countries of the world, including Russia and China, in order to deal with existential crises that humanity is facing now, such as the environmental crisis. If we're fighting each other, we aren't going to have the money to deal with the environment. And if we're fighting each other, we aren't going to have the money to deal with this health crisis, which just won't go away. It's not just in Canada. All over the world, people are having trouble dealing with health crises. And it's a lot more important to have doctors than soldiers. It's a lot more important to have water bombers than jet fighters. These are much more important to people's daily lives than all this armaments that are being produced in the West for profit.
And not only that, but I mean, like, militarism is anti-ecological. All of these stupid wars are all for extracting fossil fuels and whatnot, and that is just another doornail, another nail in the coffin for the Earth's lungs and so forth. And so, yeah,
I could not agree more. In conclusion, I'd like to, just refer people to a couple of things that they might want to read, short things, or listen to. That the de facto chair of the Syria support movement, has written an article. His name is Paul Larudee, L-A-R-U-D-E-E, and he wrote an article in Dissident Voice, which was just published today, about the fall of Syria. It's a short article, doesn't go into everything, but I think people would like that if they would, if they're interested in Syria. This would be a good article to read. The Syria support movement also has a website on which people can find many good articles about how things transpired and ended up in the sorry situation we find ourselves in today. So that's one place. Another place is our Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. We have a website and also Facebook pages. And on the Facebook page, or my Facebook page as well, Ken Stone, and the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, there are a couple of interviews with a very eminent economist and former Undersecretary of the United Nations for West Asia, Dr. Atif Kubursi. There are two interviews in which he discusses Syria. He is a native of Lebanon himself, and with many contacts, and has gone into Syria many, many times in a personal capacity, and also as the Undersecretary of the UN for West Asia. And his two interviews on the Taylor Report, I think people would find them useful. Again, those are at Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War Facebook page, or my Facebook page, Ken Stone. And the last thing, I would like to invite people to a webinar this Wednesday evening. Rick Sterling will be one of the speakers, and it's about NATO's reckless escalations in West Asia and in Ukraine, and talking about what people can do about that. So I would recommend people go to, again, my Facebook page, or to the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network website, and you will find the information there. Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network. So there are things people can do.
This episode gets uploaded to YouTube. Ken, make sure to send me all of those links, because I'm going to make sure to post all of those links.
Okay.
My final thoughts are going to be the following. I think Ken actually I couldn't have said it better myself, but I'll just I think I will just say the following, which is I do want to pay a tribute to the now former Syrian Arab Republic. And I think all of us anti-imperialists, whether we believe in violence or non-violence, we should pay huge tributes in the efforts of that country and its people in resisting imperialism for as long as they did. I cannot emphasize enough. The Syrian government and its people resisted multiple Western imperialists, Gulf monarch imperialism, Turkish imperialism, and the pirate rogue state that is the state of Israel. And they managed to resist all of their violent aggression and proxy wars and propaganda for as long as they did. And so, in that respect, we need to pay tribute to them. And I dedicate Bob Marley's song Zimbabwe and Victor Jara's anti-Vietnam War song "The Right to Live," where he pays tribute to Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese resistance to Western imperialism. So, in that, I pay tribute to the Syrian Arab Republic, and rest in peace to all of those who were martyred in fighting against the ghastly, vile system that is imperialism, and to all of the journalists, whether it's you, Ken, Rick Sterling, Max Blumenthal, Ronnie Akalik, Eva Bartlett, Vanessa Beeley, Global Research News Hour, Eve Angler, World Beyond War, when they allowed us to host this event, Breakthrough News, the Canadian Peace Congress, the Communist Party of Canada, and those are just some I can name off the top of my head. Thank you to all of those guys, Press TV, Arnold August, Dr. Mara Alsman, for all they could do in saying to people, guys, Syria, this is another Iraq, this is another Libya, this is another Afghanistan. I feel as if, oh yes, and I have to thank Orinoco Tribune, Saheli Chowdhury for helping me in preparing the show and giving me all those interesting things, and Carlos Martinez, the International Manifesto group, and their efforts. I sometimes feel as if our efforts were in vain, but I want to pay tribute to all those organizations and truth tellers, and that also includes the late John Pilger, the late Glenn Ford, and UNAC. Good night and good luck, folks. Do not give up the fight. We still have to be angry, but after that, we have to keep calm and carry on the fight against imperialism. And for that, good night and good luck. Power to the people. Death to Western imperialism, Zionism, and settler colonialism.